The notion of a civil war in the U.S. might have been unthinkable years ago, but now that is not the case. Half of Americans these days believe that a civil war is possible in the next few years. What are the reasons behind this dark scenario? On this edition of The Spotlight, we look at why the U.S., the country that preaches democracy, has reached this new low, and whether the politicians or lawmakers are even aware that the U.S. is not as united as they think it is. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Journalist and author Daniel Lazare joins us from New York. Also joining us, Emeritus Professor of History at Westchester University, Lawrence Davidson, joins us from Westchester, PA. I'd like to welcome you both, and let me first start with you, Daniel Lazare. We're looking at a study that has found that about half of Americans expect a civil war to occur in the next few years. 47.8% disagree. Curious as to why there would be a poll, but obviously there was a reason to have this question asked. Why do you think, do you agree with the results? Do you think that that is the case when it comes to your view on the possibilities of civil war in the U.S.?
Well, I think yes, it is the case. We're not quite sure what form civil war would take. It probably would not be a repeat of the one in 1861 to 65 under Abraham Lincoln. But yes, I mean, there's certainly elements of a civil war, of a coming civil war, are looming in the U.S.
Like what elements?
Well, there's just an amazing degree of polarization, political polarization, and most important, Congress is not functional. It's no longer working. It's, I mean, essentially, it's become a battleground, a deadlock for the last generation. Neither side can get its way, and as a result, passions are building up dangerously on both sides.
Which camp are you in, Lawrence Davidson? Do you agree or disagree?
No, I disagree.
Hey.
I disagree. I mean, I do certainly agree that there's an enormous polarization. That polarization, I think, has existed at least since the 1960s, and probably even before, and has expressed itself in various ways. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam, Black Lives Matter, all these sort of things. And those things reflect a culture war, essentially. And the backlash to these progressive protesting movements has been the coming forth of white supremacists, and they're armed. They've got guns, and that sort of thing. And so they are capable of small, I would emphasize small, little rebellious acts that are violent. Those acts would be almost immediately suppressed. In order to get a civil war, I mean a real civil war going, you need the police to walk off the job. You need the National Guard to refuse orders. And you need the Army, Navy, and Air Force to refuse orders too. That's not going to happen. Even under Trump, it didn't happen, when it might have been reasonable for in fact to happen. So I think that, yes, we will see violent actions and rebellions, but they will not result in a civil war.
Well, Daniel Lazare, this comes as the House Select Committee is investigating the January 6, 2021 insurrection. So far, as we understand, 8 hearings have taken place. And one of the findings saying that Trump repeatedly seems like he courted violence following his election defeat. But that was pretty close to just a snapshot of a mini civil war, in a sense, that when you take a look at it from the outside in anyways, because some of the characteristics of what Lawrence Davidson said was present during this insurrection. Do you agree?
Yes, of course. I mean, I'm not sure what the difference is between acts of violence and rebellions and civil war. To me, they pretty much merge into one another. But the point is, what January 6th showed was not that we had a unscrupulous president in the White House, but the very mechanisms of American government were breaking down. For roughly 3 hours on the afternoon of January 6th, Americans really had no idea who was fully in control. An act of succession where the baton is passed from an outgoing president to an incoming president, that didn't work. The baton was dropped, and for 3 hours, no one could pick it up. So so I think that the structure of American government is falling apart, and I think when that happens, then all kinds of hell can break loose, up to and including a civil war. Just let me add one thing: the root cause is a 235-year-old Constitution that is effectively unchangeable, and has created a government that has not worked in any reasonable democratic fashion in a quarter of a century. So that is the root problem, and even worse, that ancient Constitution is simply unchangeable.
Wow, okay. Lawrence Davidson, your reaction?
No, I agree with a lot of that. I think that the United States government has become at the federal level, has become largely dysfunctional. The Supreme Court has sort of recognized that and began to pass power from the federal government back to the states' rights kind of thing. And there we have a real difference, blue and red, So you might see right-wing supremacists take over state governments and oppress the elements of their state citizenry, who probably would then leave. But that would then, there would be a more legal and federal running around about that. But that kind of thing can happen now, okay? And maybe you will see it. But back in the early 60s, the National Guard of, what was it now? I'm going to get this wrong. One of the southern or middle states came out and protected black kids to integrate a white school, which was unheard of. But the National Guard of that state, following the orders of the president, did it. Now, what you need is a viable president, and you need an election that stops this roadblock in Congress, which your other guest correctly identified. We might be able to do that now because Trump has really modeled what the consequences of not doing that are. So we will see how the various elections play out, the primary elections and midterm elections and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. My feeling is that you were going to break the logjam with these elections. But, I've been wrong before, so.
Well, it's a wait-and-see game there. When you take a look, Daniel Lazare, at what, and I'm going to use Steve Bannon as an example because it fits in with what I want to ask. The former White House chief strategist who was found guilty of contempt. Well, he has said that the Biden administration is abetting a criminal invasion of the southern border. And he says the Democrats want to deplatform and humiliate you, the listener of his show. He has a podcast of some kind, and they want to destroy the United States of America. Now, it's not so much about Steve Bannon, it's what's coming out of his mouth and that type of viewpoint. Coming up from, he was a former chief strategist. You can't disregard that. So when it comes from that position, is that a view that's held by many?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, yeah, I agree with your other guest, Lawrence Davidson, but I think he's just taking a way too optimistic view of the situation in the U.S. The machinery is breaking down. Passions are building up to explosive levels. Either side believes the other is destroying America. Either side believes the other is engaged in a profound subversive conspiracy to overthrow the constitutional system. And this is what these are what lead to civil war, where essentially a civil war is about gets to control the fundamental mechanisms of society. So that's why, and this rhetoric, you hear this rhetoric among Democrats, you hear it among Republicans. It's increasingly violent in tone. And it already has led to violence and will undoubtedly lead to much more.
The name of his, I shouldn't promote his program, but I'm going to have to because the name is there. He calls it the War Room Posse, Lawrence Davidson, and he says that they will become foot soldiers in an army of conservatives who want to destroy the Republican Party, and that we need to crush the Democratic Party, by any means necessary. Again, it's not so much about Steve Bannon, but what he's saying and whether there are others who hold the same view. And is this in a large numbers when it comes to people at the high positions?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, what he's doing is inciting to riot. That's what he's doing. And there are large numbers. I mean, I think that my guess is the numbers that are listening to guys like Bannon run to about 30 or 40 million people in this country. Now, if you could solidify that into a violent movement, you'd have a problem. But I don't think you can. I mean, this is 30 or 40 million people spread out amongst over 300 million people. And so it would be very difficult. You can't just do it by talking, right? Anyway, parts of that 30 or 40 million are mobilized, are armed, and might very well cause trouble. I'm just saying that trouble will not rise to the level of a civil war. But the aspect of the government, that part of the equation, that's up to grabs. I mean, if we don't, if the American people don't, break this logjam in Congress and put a strong, active person in the White House, this thing's going to drag on. And the more it drags on, the more your other guest will have evidence for what he thinks is coming.
Well, let's not get into who might be a good candidate for that. But let's talk about then what the UN expert has said, Daniel Lazare, back in the year 2020, where the headline read, "Decried near tyranny in the U.S. against minority voting rights." That electoral laws in some parts of the U.S., and mentioned Texas, just undermine democracy. This would be one way that you would have blood levels rise in Americans, especially minorities, which could then break out into the open in a violent way, perhaps. What do you think about the findings of the UN there, the UN Special Rapporteur?
I think they're absolutely correct. There's no doubt about it. In many states, measures are used in order to inhibit voting by racial minorities, by Black Americans. And as a consequence, the dream of political equality has not been attained because minorities, the poor, et cetera, are penalized in various ways. But that's true for the structure of American government as well. I mean, the Senate is one of the most lopsided legislative bodies on earth. It gives the same weight to rural white states like, say, Wyoming, that it does to multiracial giants like California, even though California's population is something like 68 or 69 times larger. And most minorities live in those big urbanized states that are grossly underrepresented in the Senate. So that is the basic source of American racism, which look at it's a constitution that was created by slaveholders in 1787. 25 of the 55 delegates to the original Constitutional Convention were slave owners. Mm-hmm. So it's a slave owner's document. And that legacy, even though slavery itself has been abolished, that legacy lives on, and it affects every last aspect of American daily life and is leading to a giant political explosion.
Yeah, we're going to talk about race in just a minute, but I want you to repeat what you said there, Daniel Lazare, the underrepresentation that exists in Congress.
Yeah.
Tell us how many states, because that was indeed one of the findings of this UN Special Rapporteur. Repeat that, please.
Okay. 54% of the U.S. population lives in just 10 of the 10 states, 10 highly urbanized states, California, New York, etc. Those 10 states are outvoted 4-1 by the minority that lives in the other 40. In addition, 81% of racial minorities, that includes Asians, blacks, Hispanics, etc., also live in those top 10 states. So they are outvoted by a largely white minority in the remainder.
I mean, this is incredible, isn't it? I mean, talk about an imbalance there, Lawrence Davidson. What do you think?
It's archaic, that's for sure. And I would say that that this reflects the culture war that we're in the middle of, because what the image of America.
I'm sorry. Can I just ask you, why do you call it a culture war, or not, and not a civil war? I'm just curious.
Well, first of all, civil wars are violent. Okay, the culture war that's going on, it has not risen to that level. It's a culture between those who are progressive and want to see diversity and equality and all that stuff, and the other group whose image of America is basically, your white male, guy in a suit, or maybe not in a suit, maybe, fixing cars or something like that. It's a white man's America. And so you've got that image, and you've got this other image, much more progressive, and those two images are competing. And in the Senate, you've got a system, that there's no doubt it's imbalanced in favor of the white suit, or whatever. So there are, of course, the House is more diverse. And of course, the Constitution itself has many, many amendments that attempt, for better or worse, to modernize the government in terms of the diversity of the citizenry and what have you. So, I think that we're very much in a culture war. And the question is, can it flip over into something more violent? I think it can in places, but the reason I say that it's not going to evolve into a civil war, because civil war is in fact extraordinarily violent situation where the armed forces split, and that kind of thing.
Sure, I gotcha. So, race, minorities, Daniel Lazare, how much, if we were to look at the possibilities of those two factors, or I should say one, really just one, which is minorities. How much of a factor does that play currently when it comes to racial tensions that would fall into the lines of possibility of a civil war breaking out?
Oh, it's huge. It's just huge. I mean, first of all, blacks and other racial minorities are grossly underrepresented at the federal level. So that just automatically leads to them being treated unfairly, unjustly, number one. And number two, the legacy, as I said before, of the slaveholders lives on. So therefore, if you read between the lines, you can see that the document, the American government in general, is permeated by, by assumptions that white people are the real Americans and everybody else is an interloper of some sort or a second-class citizen. I mean, it really is a white man's republic. That's how it was conceived. And that's the way many people still think of it today. And so the consequences for racial minorities are sweeping. I mean, if you look at the prison population, I mean, black people are overrepresented by a factor of 10 to 1, and it's due in great part to the racial inequities that are baked into the system.
All right, Detroit, Michigan, I'm going to mention some cities, Lawrence Davidson, Memphis, Tennessee, and Birmingham, Alabama. Top 3 cities, the year 2021. These are the cities in the U.S. that have the most violence occurring, homicides to have increased in those cities, and the ranking hence comes in at 1, 2, and 3. I'm not too sure if you're familiar with those 3 cities, but obviously they're very violent. And those are scenarios where really, forget the word civil, it's just violence, people getting killed, now for a variety of reasons. And there are many cities that have areas like that, especially in cities that have projects where we know how dangerous those projects can be. Has the U.S. turned more dangerous as the years have gone by?
Yeah, it has. I mean, essentially, the rule of law has been withdrawn from many areas in most cities. This has something to do with the divisions within the police department, black and white, the attacks on the funding of the police by minority groups who feel that they're being oppressed by these guys.
Right.
And so the ability to reform the police.
All right, I'm sorry, Lawrence Davidson, I have to jump in because we're fresh out of time. I do apologize. Okay. Lawrence Davidson there, Emeritus Professor of History at Westchester University. Daniel Lazare, thank you so much. Great information there from him, journalist and author from New York. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight from Mika Tarway and the team. It's goodbye until next time.